Well, good evening. How we doing tonight? Awesome. So excited to see so many people here tonight. This is awesome. If you didn't get a handout, there are handouts on that little music stand by the door back there. Um, so make sure you get one so you can follow along as we're talking tonight. Tonight's handout is going to be really important. And if we have 80 copies back there, but in case we run out, there's quite a few in here. If you don't get one, we'll hopefully have more printed for next week. There was some issues with the church printer today and everything. But on the back of these handouts, I have some maps and a timeline and some stuff that we're going to be kind of referring to throughout the class. So it'll be helpful with you. I suggest in the coming weeks to bring this week one handout back with you every week. So you have these maps to look back at in the timeline and that kind of stuff. So, all right, are we ready? All right, I want to get rolling right away here because I have way too much to say tonight. Wait, I mean, like, I know, I'm a joke because I say that every Wednesday, but again, I mean it tonight. Um, Trying to cram, or our hope is so if you don't know where you're at the annual Revelation Bible study. And tonight we're starting the book of Daniel, and we're going to spend 5 weeks on Daniel, and then we're going to go into Revelation, and Pastor Josh is going to take over at that point and share 10 weeks on the book of Revelation with you. So, show of hands, how many people have been to some kind of a Daniel and or Revelation study before, or like watched videos on, or something to that kind of stuff? There always seems to be something going on in that regard. My guess is now I don't know what your experience has been. I don't know the kind of things you've learned about them. My guess is what you're going to gain in this class might be a little different than what you've heard. Typically, these classes and seminars or whatever that you attend or see, they're kind of filled with all these timelines of future events and how things are going to unfold in the end and all that kind of stuff. Well, we're going to present in this class just to get the shock factor over here. So we're going to present in this class something very different than that. And I hate to even use the words an alternative view for studying this. It's kind of become that. But honestly, the way these books are typically approached in today's day and age of modern Western Christianity is actually a relatively new development. It is something that was kind of in the 1800s, generally, where that kind of teaching, the teaching that you would kind of see, like if you've seen the Left Behind movies, you've seen the Left Behind movies or books, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that kind of approach to these books is honestly a relatively new approach, really from like the 1800s on, and it has become very popular in America and very 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 popular in the evangelical church world and that kind of stuff, to the point that when other approaches are even suggested to these books, sometimes people get help for blasphemy. So I hope no one brought their hanging noose or any tomatoes. I know Bruce finds a few tomatoes. Where is he? I gotta be done. Oh, he's right. Oh, he's really close. So I gotta get. Here, I couldn't find him. He's right there. So he's always threatening to throw tomatoes at me. Um, so bottom line though is, I at no point, I know Pastor Josh or I at no point are going to say, our view on this or the way we're presenting this to you is 100% right. And if you don't believe it, you're out of the church. Like, if I've learned anything about the Bible as a whole, not even just these books, it's to present them with an incredible, excuse me, come to them with an incredible amount of humility. Yes. The more I study scripture, the more I realize I haven't got a clue. That's really what it comes down to. And I think knowledge, wisdom, whatever, any pursuit of any kind of knowledge is like that. The more you learn about something, the more you realize how little you know about something. And, you've always, have you ever used the phrase or heard the phrase, you know just enough to be dangerous? And I think that's what happens with these books a lot. There's a very superficial knowledge or exposure to them, and it can be dangerous. So I'm excited to approach the book of Daniel with you guys. This is probably my favorite book to study. I absolutely um, and I really mean that. I love studying all of the Old Testament, but when it comes to this book, I get excited in a way I don't get in really many other books. And it's partly because for a time it was because as I studied deeper and deeper and deeper, I began unveiling this approach to it or this understanding that was different than anything I'd heard or been taught in evangelical church circles kind of growing up. But also the core teaching or the new understanding I was getting out of this book was something far more powerful than ever before. And the message of this book, and really of Revelation as well, but the message of these books is something that just it is so important for Christians, or I should say followers of God, um, because originally it's written to Jewish people, and now we as Christians, it's part of our scripture, right? It is so important to us at any age, whether we lived over 2,000 years ago or we live now. It is such an important message for us, and so I encourage you. If you have questions, it's fine to ask them. We do have a lot of stuff to get through, so and we have a lot of people. So I don't know that we'll have time for every single question. I know something we kind of want to do along the way is if you have a question you want to ask, and maybe we don't have enough time to really get into it, you can, first of all, you can totally, hit me up after class or whatever. I'd love to chat with you about anything, or Pastor Josh. Josh will also be, while I'm teaching, maybe taking some notes, kind of writing down any questions that we can address maybe in a later class, or at the very least try to get back to you on. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Just know that I might not be able to go as deep into it just so we can actually get through the material because we're really limiting ourselves with doing this for 15 weeks only. And we'll see if we can actually hit that 15-week mark. And I'm already rambling to start this class tonight, so it's bad. But my encouragement to you is anything that you know or you think you know about Daniel and Revelation, I want you guys to just kind of hold it in an open hand and trust God with that. And if God needs to take something out and change it, allow Him to do that. The most dangerous place we can be as believers when it comes to learning the Bible is to think we got it right and hold on to that so tightly that we don't allow God to evolve our understanding of who He is and of the Scriptures. That doesn't mean that we buy into every new little teaching that we hear, but we also need to, with careful discernment, study the Scriptures and allow ourselves to grow in our understanding of them, in whatever way that means. All right. So does that make sense? Are we all on board with that? Are you guys willing to maybe take an approach you haven't taken or thought of before? You'd be okay with that? So, all right. And bottom line, all we're doing here is we're just really trying to get to the truth of God's word. That's what this is all about. So, before approaching the book of Daniel, two pieces of background information are essential. I'm kind of looking at my handout now. Just going to read through my opening little paragraphs I have written here to kind of set the stage. Two pieces of background are, excuse me, two pieces of background information are essential. And these are what we will discuss in this class. First, the reader of Daniel must be aware of the historical setting of what's going on in the historical background of these books. Daniel was written during a time of great upheaval in the Jewish community. Their future was uncertain, and many people were questioning when or if God would put an end to their suffering. The great prophets gave many inspiring words of promise, but these promises seemed long overdue to become reality. The book of Daniel seeks to address these questions by putting into perspective the rise and fall of empires and how God was in control throughout it all. In a nutshell, the book of Daniel gave its readers comfort to know that all the craziness around them was not a surprise to God, and He would ultimately make everything right. Additionally, it is key to know that the visions of Daniel speak to the original reader's immediate situations. I can't stress that part enough right there. That those crazy visions of Daniel, they speak to the original reader's immediate situations. They do not necessarily concern events still to come in our future, as modern readers often surmise. As we go through this class, the reasons for this claim will become evident. So that's the first thing, the historical background and understanding what's being addressed. Second, it is important to understand the existence and utilization of something called apocalyptic literature. Raise your hand if you've heard of that before. If you've been in my classes, you might have heard that before. Um, so, apocalyptic literature in the Jewish community, it rose in popularity during the intertestamental period. So that's the time between the Old and New Testaments. The term comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means revelation or something that is revealed. The last book of the New Testament is called Revelation because the opening words of the book are Apocalypsis Jesu Christo, which translates to the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, or in English, as we put it, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, the term apocalypse is now popularly used to refer to end time events. So usually if you hear someone say like, oh, it's the apocalypse, right? You think, oh, it's the end of days, right? That's like kind of media has hooked onto that. There's movies, Apocalypse Now, like that kind of stuff. It has come along with the idea to just be, oh, it's the end time stuff. Um, so but anyway, but that's not at all what the term is meant to imply. It is a term given to a type of literature that seeks to reveal truth through vivid imagery, mysterious dreams, historical reviews, and heavenly journeys. And these books are often written synonymously, meaning in the name of another person. So, the purpose of apocalyptic literature was not to give random facts about events thousands of years in the original reader's future, but to address their current situation, typically offering words of wisdom, advice, and comfort. The book of Daniel is a prime example of this, and we cannot hope to properly interpret it without an understanding of apocalyptic literature. So those are the two big things I want to hit tonight, the historical background information and what on earth is apocalyptic literature. This goes with studying any book of the Bible, or really any document you pick up and read, whether it be a text message or an email or a scholarly journal writing, whatever it may be. You have to know before you start reading that thing what type of literature it is. Okay? For example, you get a text message on your phone, you're going to read that a little differently than you're going to read the newspaper or and then even though it's from, you get a text message from your best friend, you might read that differently than if you get a text message from your grandma, or whatever. Or if you're writing an email to someone, you're going to use different wording than if you're writing an academic paper, for those kind of things. So genre really matters. And so that's no secret, right? We know if we're reading the Bible that if we're reading narrative, a story being told. We're going to approach that differently than if we read poetry, right? Because poetry can have metaphors in it and all that kind of stuff. We don't take it as literally as we would a narrative. Daniel and Revelation are actually their own unique type of literature called apocalyptic literature. And it's difficult for modern readers to read them well because we don't have anything like that anymore. There's nothing that's even remotely close to apocalyptic literature in our day and age, right? We have poetry, we have narratives, we have fiction, we have whatever. We have news and history. We have all these different types of literature, but we don't have apocalyptic literature. So before we can even begin to approach Daniel and Revelation, we have to understand what it is we're reading and how to process it as we're reading it. So that's why that's going to be important. We'll get into more details about that. So let's get into the history part of it. I apologize. A lot of tonight is going to be like a history class. Is anybody gonna walk out? Nobody? Okay. All right. Hopefully nobody walked out. But to understand what Daniel's talking about, to understand what's in the visions, you have to know the history surrounding the Jewish people at that time. Otherwise, it's not going to make any sense. Because all those visions and dreams that Daniel has, this crazy imagery, it's referring to what's going on in the world around him. And if you don't know what's going on in the world around him, you won't be able to pick up on what that imagery is talking about. Okay? But before we get to that, so to place ourselves in history, the first thing we have to do is date the book of Daniel. When was this book written? And this is the first point in which there is kind of some contention about where is this book to be dated. So if you read the book of Daniel, if you're familiar with it, I guess for anyone who's not, I should just summarize it really quickly. The first six chapters of the book of Daniel are stories, and they're set in a time of the Babylonian exiles. People of Israel, the Jewish people, 587, 586 BC, the whole city of Jerusalem was taken by the Babylonians, and they were taken into exile into Babylon. Okay, so the stories of the book of Daniel are in that setting. That's the time period that they're set in. And it follows Daniel and a few of his faithful friends in their exploits, right? And we have such stories as Daniel and the lion's den, right? They're in Babylon and they're being told that you need to bow down, and we don't want to bow down, so then he gets thrown in the lion's den. Or you need to bow down to our false gods, or if you're not, we'll throw you in the fiery furnace, right? And or you have to eat the king's food, and we don't want to eat the king's food. So it's basically a bunch of stories that if you were in Sunday school, I know you've heard them. You're probably familiar at the very least with Daniel in the Lion's Den or the Fourth Man in the Fire, those kind of stories. They're stories of God's people remaining faithful in an unfaithful land. And so you're reading through Daniel, and you're like, these are good stories. And I remember flannelgrams when I was a kid. What flannelgrams? Talking about. So if you don't, I'm sorry, you've missed out on life. But then you get to chapter 7, and then it gets weird. You get to this point in the book where you have these cute little stories. I mean, I guess being thrown in the fire is not too cute. But you get these Sunday school worthy stories, and then all of a sudden you get these wacko visions and dreams where you have beasts coming out of the sea and things being destroyed, and this goat with so many horns, and what on earth just happened to my fun little book? And that's what we're going to really be focusing on in this class, are those dreams and those visions. And what are they referring to? And this is where you get that wide range of interpretation. You have one camp, the more modern, recent camp, kind of saying, okay, it's talking about end time stuff all the way in our future. And what I'm going to hopefully help you see that I really believe is talking about is what's going on at the reader's time and how it speaks to their situation in that moment. So all of that hopefully will make sense as we go through the class. So if you look at all of that and you take into consideration all of the the data that we can pull from these visions and the events in history that we're referring to, ultimately what we discover is that Daniel was very likely written in the second century BC. So that means sometime in the 100s BC. So that's less than 200 years before Christ. Now, I just got done telling you that the Babylonian exile, those stories, the setting of that was back in the 500s BC, which is several hundred years prior to that. The stories are of Daniel. But what's very likely to have happened is these stories were written much, much later about an earlier occurrence, looking back in history about something that probably happened to a guy named Daniel and his friends, and these stories were written down. And then these visions were written down as if Daniel was having them and looking forward to what was happening, but they were actually written after the fact, looking back. And this is actually, we'll talk more about this at the end of class when we get to the apocalyptic literature part, because that is a classic part of what apocalyptic literature is. Most apocalyptic writings are what's called historical review, where it's written pseudonymously, meaning using another person's name. So someone's writing and they're pretending to be writing as if it was Daniel writing. And they're writing down all these events. And from the perspective of Daniel, they haven't happened yet, right? So they're written as if they're like predictive prophecy. But the writer's actually looking back over time and writing these things down um, and then presenting them. And there's reasons for that. We'll get into all of that. I just need to give those little tidbits for right now. So for all of those reasons, understanding what apocalyptic literature is and all that kind of stuff, And all that will make more sense by the end of the class. Daniel, more so than any other of the Old Testament books, can probably precisely be dated to a very specific year when it was written. And it was probably written in 165 BC. So it's very interesting that Daniel is one of the most hotly debated about when it was written, but it's also probably the book in the Old Testament that we can be most precise about dating. Because most of the Old Testament books, we really have no clue when they were written. We really don't. It's all best guess. But this one, and that's by the time we get to the end of the class, it'll become more clear why we can say that. So, bottom line, the book of Daniel was likely written in 165 BC. This was shortly after the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who we're going to talk about tonight, invaded Jerusalem. He outlawed the practice of the Jewish faith and desecrated the temple by setting up an altar to Zeus. All of this will be covered in the historical review section. Okay, so that was just setting the stage a little bit. If you're anybody thoroughly confused yet, sorry if you are, but hopefully now I want to go through and I'm going to talk about the history from the Babylonian Empire up until when I believe the book of Daniel was written. And this is the history part that is actually going to be really important. So I encourage you, I don't expect you to get all of this tonight, but I have it written pretty well detailed in this handout. So I encourage you to bring this home and review it. The better you are acquainted with this history, the more the future classes are going to make sense to you. So if you want the future classes, when we get into the dreams and visions to make sense to you, learn this. Do some, shall I say, homework. Let's see, can I give homework? Oh man, I said history and homework, the two H words. This is bad. It's history homework, the worst kind. So, okay, so let's do a little historical review here. Okay, so we have the Babylonian exile. I already talked about this a little bit, but in 612 BC. Oh, and by the way, if you look at the very back of your handout, I have a timeline. All right. So if you want, you can even just follow this timeline while I'm sharing things if you don't want to follow along in your handout as I'm kind of presenting things. But this is hopefully a helpful, quick little thing for you that you can look at. And in front of that, I have maps that I'll be referring to along the way here as we go through this history. All right. So in 612 BC, and also, sorry, one more thing. I always hate to assume people know things, but do you know that BC years run reverse, right? So basically, if you take when Jesus was born as year zero, all the years after that leading up to us count up, right? And then BC years going before Christ, as you count backwards, the years get up going backwards, right? So BC 1 is the closest to Christ, and 2 is further away. So the higher the number in BC, the older it is. So I didn't know if you guys remember that or not. So make sure we know what we're talking about. Okay, so 612 BC, the Babylonians overthrow the Assyrians. You read about that in the Bible. And the Medes come in, the Median people come in and help, and they're going to play an important role in Daniel's. Just to mention their name now. But after a couple decades in 586 BC is when the Babylonians basically sack Jerusalem and they tear down the temple, they burn it all down, they just completely destroy it. Uh, it's really horrific what they did to Jerusalem, the siege and how people were dying, and horrible, horrible experience for the Jewish people. And at that point, the Jewish people were all taken into exile into Babylon and many of them also fled. Not all of them ended up in Babylon. Some of them fled to Egypt or Asia Minor. And so basically, after this whole Babylon experience happened, the Jews were spread out all over the world. All right, the known world in the ancient Near East at least. So they weren't just all in one unit taken to Babylon, but many, many, many of them were taken to Babylon. And this presented a major crisis for the Jewish people because they now had a crisis of identity, right? Who are we? Are we a people anymore? For years, our prophets have been telling us that we are the people of God and that He has wonderful things for us. And that someday, through us, we're going to change the world and bring light to all the nations, right? These are the promises they've had. And now they don't even have a home, right? It's all gone. So this is an identity crisis that happened in this moment where they began questioning are God's promises real? Like, can we believe they're still going to happen? And what do we do about this? And during that time period, God sent prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel to speak to their immediate situation. Jeremiah was instrumental in speaking to the people at that time. And that's, I think, of all the books of prophecy, his might be my favorite. And just because of the time in which he lived and the people in which he spoke to and the situation he had to speak to, it was intense for him, very, very intense. But Jeremiah's core message to the people was basically do nothing, right? It was basically do nothing. It was your idolatry, your sin has brought you to this place. There's going to be consequences for that, and you need to just let it in God's hands. Don't try to fight back, right? Don't try to stand up to it. You need to let this run its course and let God do his thing. That was basically what Jeremiah's message was. That's a hard message to take. When the world's crashing in on you, and people you know are dying, and your home's burning to the ground, and the message from God is do nothing. That's a tough message. It's a really tough message. By the way, it's pretty similar to the enemy's message. So, anyway, but Jeremiah gave a lot of promises. So that's what's happening with the Babylonian Empire. 539 BC. So some decades later, a guy named Cyrus the Great comes along and leads the Persians against the Babylonians. And so at 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire falls. The Persian Empire comes to power. This is still within the Old Testament biblical timeline. You can read all about this in the Old Testament. And this was much, much better for the people. Babylon usually ruled with a very harsh hand, taking people into exile, forcing them to practice religions other than their own, that kind of stuff. The Persians were much kinder in this respect. And there was actually beginning to be an understanding from the Persians moving forward that typically if you treat the people you conquer with a little bit of respect, they're a lot easier to control. So this is kind of the things that they were learning over time, and Cyrus did a really good job of it. He began signing decrees that allowed the exiled people to go back to their homeland. That included the Jewish people. So the people that were exiled in Babylon, now under Persian rule, were allowed to go back home. And you can read about these returns in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. A man named Zerubbabel and Joshua. Joshua is a very key figure. Remember his name. He was the high priest at the time. Then you can read about the first couple chapters of Ezra. They return back and begin rebuilding the temple. Okay, this all happened under Cyrus and Persia's rule. And many, many decades later, there's another return under a man called Ezra. And then shortly after that, there's another return under a man named Nehemiah. So in groups, the people of the Jewish people began coming back. Not all of them came back. Now they've been living in Babylon for generations. And there was actually a very large Jewish population in Babylon, as there was in Egypt. Most of the people in Egypt were ones that fled during the Babylonian experience that was going on. So we have pockets of Jews living all around the world. So, yes, they're returning back home, but at the same time, they're still having an identity crisis because the questions are being asked, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a child of Israel? It used to mean that we had a nation. Now, how do we define that? Because are the people that live in Asia Minor, are they still part of Israel? Are they still part of us? And this is eventually what leads to like synagogues popping up and that kind of stuff, so that you could have more of a decentralized worship because it was always centralized before that, right? Come to Jerusalem, worship at the temple. But a decentralized worship began to form. And so the Jewish identity was shifting at this time. So a time of shifting. And you can imagine, it's easy to think back and you just think, oh, okay, the Jewish people, and we think of them as like kind of one like mono people, right? That's not true. Like think about Christianity today, and we have like 9 million denominations and lots of different ways of thinking about it. The Jewish world was like that back in that day, right? You see evidence of that a little bit in Jesus' day, even within Jerusalem itself, like the religious sects the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they didn't get along very well. They had different beliefs. And so you see that in Jesus' day. A lot of that was beginning here, right? Because you had people holding to the fact, no, we have to have the temple and only worship here. And then, well, no, well, it's okay for the people in Egypt to worship there. And, so it's an identity crisis. So you have to understand what they're going through here, within the Jewish community. So all this began happening under the Persians. And then a guy comes along named Alexander the Great. So the Persians ruled for a long time, much longer than the Babylonians, mostly because of how they treated their conquered people. But in 336 BC, a man rose to power called Alexander the Great, and he's all the way from what we call Greece, right? And so he decides to take on the Persian Empire, and so he marches east. And if you look at those maps you have in the back, you can kind of locate where Greece is, and you can see where Asia Minor is, and that's where modern day Turkey is. He marches across that whole peninsula and just has victory after victory after victory. And Alexander the Great won basically every battle he fought. And within 10 years, he completely owned the ancient Near East. He took away the Persian Empire and he owned everything from Greece down to Egypt, all the way over to India, the borders of India. And actually, when he got to the Indus River, which is the northern border of India, he wanted to continue and go into India and keep conquering. But his people had seen nothing but war for 10 years. And they basically said, no, we're not going any further. We're done. So he had to turn back. And then on his way back through, he actually stopped over at Babylon and he died there of an illness at the age of 32. So he did all this before 32. You guys feel unaccomplished in your life now? Like, what on earth am I doing with my life, right? He did all of this by 32. So he was an incredible warrior. But one of the things he had going for him was he took what the Persians did and even did it better in that he wasn't basically out there just to destroy everyone, but he was making a lot of friends along the way. See, for some years, even before Alexander came to power, the Greek culture was gaining prominence. So I think the next page here, I have a section called Hellenism. So if you can find that, if you want to look at that. So the Greek culture was gaining a lot of prominence. And it was very different from how the ancient Near East used to think. In the ancient Near East, there was a bunch of little city-states all over the place, and they all had their own gods, their own pantheon of gods that they worshipped. They had their own little belief systems, and I mean, they would sometimes play nice with each other and sometimes not. But it was very localized. It was a very localized way of thinking. The Greek culture changed all that. It took the thinking of the day from nationalism to our own little nation state to cosmopolitan, to more of a global way of thinking. And that was actually embraced wonderfully. So a lot of new things come in. So look at the bottom of that page where it talks about Hellenism. Characteristic, and the word Hellenism really just comes from a Greek word Hellenikos, which means pertaining to Greece. So it just means Greekified. But here's what you have in Hellenism. First of all, strong, see if this sounds familiar to you. Strong individualism. All right? Because before that, ancient Near East, it was all about your community and your corporate mindset. It wasn't so much about the individual. But with Greek culture, strong individualism, a move towards a democratic type of government. Yes, there was still a king or an emperor, but there was a lot of people under him, and they had autonomous rules and that kind of stuff. There was a shift, again, like I said, from nationalistic to cosmopolitan thinking. There was a lessening of importance placed on religious thinking or practice. Religion still played a big part, but it was just part of your life. It wasn't everything. Okay. Literature began to be more focused on the enjoyment of the reader. This is new to the world, to that part of the world. The idea of literature for enjoyment, you don't find that before the Greeks in this part of the world. In today's day and age, literature is almost always for enjoyment. Pick up a good book and enjoy yourself. Back then, though, it was you would have wisdom literature, you'd have religious texts, you'd have laws, and you'd have treaties, but like there wasn't just read for enjoyment. This was part of that great culture. Human intellect or reason was the highest good in the path to happiness. So it was no longer pleasing your God, it was about human reason. Okay? Free inquiry into scientific matters was gaining acceptance. Art, drama, rhetoric, philosophy began to take center stage. Rationalism and the cross examination of all truth claims became more prevalent. And the Greek language began to spread like wildfire. So, does any of that sound kind of like the culture we live in today? So, yes. Yeah. Nationalistic, what I mean by that is like your own little nation state. You're very concerned about who you are and what your beliefs are. Cosmopolitan is a more of a global mindset. It's like I'm open to hearing about the beliefs of the world and incorporate that into my own. A very good example of that is when Paul in the New Testament is traveling around and he gets to Athens, Greece, right? And there's a bunch of philosophers that basically they just sit around and talk new philosophies all day. And they were very intrigued in what Paul had to say because it was new. So Paul's telling them about their God, and they're all like, it's cool, but they didn't really care much because that was their thing. They just liked hearing new thoughts. So that's kind of an example of that. But this very much so feels like our society today. And in fact, you know, American society as we know it really comes from the Greco-Roman world, because the Romans really took on also the way the Greeks thought and the way the Greeks lived. You'd be aware of this, but the Romans even have the same gods, right? Sometimes they have different names. But the way the Greeks lived life got very popular and it changed the ancient Near East. So most of the places that Alexander went, people accepted him with open arms. There wasn't even a battle. There wasn't even a fight. People were just like, yes, we want what you have. We've been hearing how exciting this way of living is. And so it was embraced. Um, but can you guess the one people group in the ancient Near East that rejected the Greek way of living more than any others? The Jewish people. Yeah. Because that doesn't really line up with how God had taught them how to live. And that has a whole different teaching on about America and the way we do life, and is that the way God wants us to live? I think any of that. Right? So, but a lot of it had to do with religious practices, honestly. The Greeks embraced new anything, right? Because they wanted to hear it because it was new. So if you served a different God than they served, the old mindset was our God's better than your God. And so when ancient Near East cultures would fight, it was our God fighting your God, and whichever God wins the better God, right? But when the Greeks come in and say, "Oh, you have a new God," well, we want to know about your new God so that we can incorporate your God into our pantheon of gods, and we can all be one happy God family, right? So that's a very offensive thought to the Jewish people. Now, the rest of the ancient Near East accepted a little more readily because most of them were already polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods, right? But not the Jewish people. They believed in the one true God, in Yahweh. So, very much so, they did not accept this way of thinking. But basically, throughout the entire ancient Near East, you could not stop the Greek mindset, the Greek way of life. This Hellenization took over and just completely changed the landscape. Perhaps you've noticed that when you get to the New Testament, what language is the New Testament written in? It's written in Greek originally. Right? The Old Testament's written in Hebrew, most of it. A little bit of Aramaic here and there, but the New Testament's written in Greek. All right. And I don't know if you've ever, stopped to think about that, but like, how did that happen? This is how it happened because the entire engineering embraced the Greek world, and the Greek language over time became the standard language. And if you take that even a step further, you can say, now, wait a minute, though. When you get to the New Testament, it's the Romans who are in control. Who knows what the language of the Roman Empire was? Latin. Absolutely. So you're like, why aren't they speaking Latin in the New Testament world? Because the Romans basically cried out. They didn't try to push what they believed on everything because the Greek power was so strong, they actually just adopted. So yes, Latin was their mother tongue, but they also did their commerce in the Greek language and they just embraced the Greek culture and they brought that in as being part of who they are. That's how powerful it was. So that part of the world was speaking Greek in no time, basically. Just took a generation or two. It happened very, very fast. Um, so this is Alexander's main legacy because he didn't obviously live very long, right? He did all this conquering in about 10 years and then he died. But his legacy lasts forever because he wanted to do more than just conquer a bunch of people. He wanted to bring the Greek culture everywhere. So he would do a lot of things, like he would arrange marriages with local leaders, with Greek leaders, and he would establish people who believed his way as leaders on all the different provinces that he would form and all this kind of stuff. So he did a lot of things very intentionally to make sure that all of this would spread. So, like I said, the Jewish people were primarily one of the very few people that actually rejected this and didn't want to take this in as part of who they were. That being said, though, there was still a large portion of the Jewish people that did. And so I had already told you a little bit that you can see for the first time the Jewish people really becoming divided in a way they hadn't been before. It was, does worship have to be centralized? Can the people in Asia Minor or Babylon or, Egypt, can they worship God the way we should worship God? And, these synagogues, are they okay? So all this kind of stuff was happening already. But now you have the people in Jerusalem and in Judea, many of them are actually embracing this Greek way of life. They're taking on the Greek culture, taking on the Greek language. And so you even have the schism forming within the Jewish people themselves. So they're not their own nation anymore. Okay, even though they're living in relative peace right now, they still don't own their own nation, right? They're under the control of the Persians or the Greeks or somebody else. All right, so there's a bit of an identity crisis right there. The way in which they worship is evolving and they're struggling with that. They're trying to figure that out. And now there's a battle within their society of, do we embrace Greek culture and language or do we not? And so all these troubles are happening within the Jewish people, not to mention all the outside pressures from these other empires and all this kind of stuff. So still a very difficult time for the Jewish people. And this is all happening over a period of several hundred years, okay, from the time of the Babylon exile to the time of Alexander. That's over 200 years at this point. That's like 250-ish years. And somebody calls, and people call the intertestamental period the silent years. They were anything but silent. They were very tumultuous. Okay? So this is a lot of what's going on. Well, things after Alexander start getting bad for the Jewish people. Um, Again, under the Persians, they lived in relative peace. They were left alone for the most part. And they probably ruled themselves. Archaeology has even found from that time period coins that would say Yehudai, which is the word for Judah. So they probably had their own coinage and their own governors. And so they were self-governed for the most part. All right. So Alexander comes in, begins to change everything. Alexander dies, and this is when things really begin to fall apart bad. Alexander, at his death, remember he's young, okay? His only legitimate successors are a 1-year-old son and a mentally ill brother. So neither are equipped to take over the empire. So his generals under him did not want to accept being under the rule of either of those. So, as the nice people as they are, they quickly killed his 1-year-old son and his brother and his mother. All right, so they wiped out everyone from Alexander's family. And for the next 20 or so years, they had a civil war within this new empire that had been grown. So all these generals, these leaders, began fighting amongst themselves who would succeed Alexander, who would take control of this empire. It's actually known as the Wars of the Doki, which means, or Diadochi, which means successors, so the War of the Successors. All this came to an end in 301 BC, so that's Alexander died in 323, so 301, so that's over 20 years these wars went on. And if you turn to those maps I have, the most important map that we're going to refer to the most is the division of the Greek Empire. It's the fourth map. You guys all see that? So this is how that after this fighting happened, the Greek Empire was basically split up into four groups. That's important to remember. Remember that. The Greek Empire was split up into four different groups. So all the way over where Greece is, you can see one group was kind of known as Greece, one was known as Thrace. They're not really important to the biblical story, so you don't really need to remember that. But the two that are really important are, you can see the huge area to the east is the Seleucid kingdom. That's going to be very important. And then down where Egypt is are the Ptolemies. So the two things that become very important to the Jewish people moving forward in the Greek Empire and the way it splits up is the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Do you see where Jerusalem is? Do you happen to see where Jerusalem is? If you can find it, right? It's on that little land bridge that runs between the Mediterranean Sea and that whole white area where it says division of the Greek Empire after Alexander. That's just desert. Like that's no man's land. Like you can't live there, right? So that Jerusalem exists in this little land bridge between the Seleucid and the Ptolemy kingdom. And do you know what the Seleucids and the Ptolemies did for the next couple hundred years? They fought for control of that region. That does not make for good days for the Jewish people. So they were constantly in the middle of fighting, and a lot of times the fighting was in their own backyard between these two people. Now, initially, they're under the control of the Ptolemies. So from 301 BC to 198 BC, they're under the control of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies own Egypt at this point. So any pharaohs that you read about from this time, they're actually Greek pharaohs. For many years, the Greeks operated as pharaohs in Egypt, right? And that was the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty. So till eventually, in 198 BC, the Seleucids try to finally win back the whole Palestine area, right? They win that area back under a guy named Antiochus III. All right, so turn to the page where you see Antiochus III there. So this is when things really began to change for the Jewish people. For the most part, the last 100 years, they did not enjoy life under the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies would often enslave them, treat them harshly, overtax them. It was not a good century for them. They struggled a lot during that time. So, when Antiochus, the leader of the Seleucid kingdom, was gaining power and seeming like he'd have the ability to overthrow the Ptolemies, not completely, but at least to the point where he could take over Jerusalem. Because that land bridge there is really important to own. Still to this day, people are fighting it, right? It's a really important piece of real estate, right? So Antiochus III set his sights on regaining that and to fighting on Egypt. The Jewish people actually sided with him and fought with him to help them to get the Ptolemies off their back, essentially. Uh, and according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, the Jews initially received this with open arms. And so when Antiochus III became the new leader, it was a good day for the Jewish people. They thought things are going to get better from here. And indeed, it did start really good. So I have a list here of some of the things that Antiochus III did. He ordered the release of the Jewish refugees taken captive during the conflict. He gave a remission of taxes for 3 years. The Jews could govern themselves and practice their religion freely. Tax exempt status was given to priests and elders and scribes. Wood needed for the altar was declared tax free. We all like those. And needed repairs for the temple were to be provided by the state. So Antiochus III had a really good start, and he looked like he was taking a lesson from some of those previous rulers of if you treat your conquered people with respect and let them kind of have their own autonomy, you'll have a good experience with them. So he seemed to be getting off on a good start. But Antiochus III was having so much success in his endeavors that he got a little too bold and he decided, I'm now going to take on this. And the Roman Empire had not, obviously, at this point, expanded to what it eventually would become this behemoth of an empire, the largest empire the world will ever see, probably, and has ever seen. Um, but they were very powerful at this point. But so you guys have heard of Hannibal, right? The Carthaginian. You've heard of. All right, you've heard of Hannibal. So he had some serious, he came in and battled against Rome and he almost won. But Rome eventually turned him away. So where did this guy go? Good old Hannibal came crying to Antiochus III, formed an alliance with him, and the two of them decided we're going to go back and try to meet up on Rome. And this ultimately was not only the beginning of the downfall of the Seleucid kingdom, but it was the beginning of some of the hardest years the Jewish people had ever gone through. This is where life got really, really, really bad. And eventually, and pretty soon, we're going to get to the point when the book of Daniel is written and why it was written. So, Antiochus III loses very, very badly to the Romans. He had to yield almost all of Asia Minor. He had to surrender his war elephants and his navy. He had to surrender 20 hostages, including his son Antiochus IV. He's going to become very important very soon. But this is the biggest thing right here. He had to pay a huge indemnity to Rome. Rome asked for a ton of money from him, more money than he could possibly come up with. And this is something that actually haunted the Seleucid kingdom for years to come because of the money that they needed to pay Rome. They became such a weakened place that Rome could switch them like a buck if they wanted to. But Rome was happy and off their backs as long as they were receiving enough money from them, right? Sounds like a good old creditor, right? Just give me some money and our relationship's fine. So this is when Antiochus III resorted to going around to his conquered peoples and basically plundering from them. He would break into people's temples and take, because that's where all the riches were in the temples, right, to their gods and stuff. So he'd break into temples and he would steal money. And you guessed it, he did it to Jerusalem, right? So this is when things started getting a little harsh. And Antiochus III, on the next page there, you can see he actually died in 187 when he was assassinated while robbing a temple in Elam to get money to pay the Romans. So while he was actively doing this, he was assassinated. People didn't like their money being stolen, so they killed him for it. So the ruler after him was Seleucus IV. There's not much to be said about him, but he was also going around attempting to obtain funds from temples, keeping that up because Rome was still demanding their money. While Seleucus IV was in power, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Antiochus III's son, that had been sent to Rome as a hostage, remember that? He gets released from Rome, and shortly after he's released, Seleucus just happens to be assassinated. Doesn't raise the eyebrows there. But it's never officially put on Antiochus IV, and most historians say, yeah, he did it, because the timing was just too different there. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes the next ruler, and this is where it gets really, really, really bad. He becomes a main player, and he is written about a lot in the book of Daniel. Okay? So he takes on the name Epiphanes, which means the manifest one, or God manifest. He's not the first ruler to claim this title, but he did, and that tells you a little bit something about him right there. He inherited a very unstable kingdom. Um, so he tried to unify his kingdom by pushing Hellenization harder than ever. So forcing the Greek language, forcing the Greek culture, um, not just allowing people who embraced it to accept it, but he is by forcing it on people. This is a new level of you have to take on who we are as the Greek people. And he would go to extreme lengths, even further than the people before him, to acquire money that was needed to pay off the Romans. Then he began meddling in Jewish affairs. Onias III, that's an important guy to remember. He was high priest in Jerusalem at the time that Antiochus IV became king. Okay, he was still in the traditional lineage of high priests, and he was actually in Antioch. You remember that name from the New Testament, Antioch, right? We spent a lot of time there. Antiochus, that's where that name came from. It was named after the Antiochus rulers. So Antioch was the Seleucid capital. And that's where Onias was at the time where Seleucus IV was assassinated, and he actually became trapped there and he couldn't get home. So this guy, his name was Joseph, but he actually went by Jason, which is a Greek name, so that tells you about him. He's a Jewish guy going by a Greek name, so he was one of the Hellenized Jews. While Aeneas was gone, Antiochus IV, a new ruler, was in power. He saw his chance, and so he paid Antiochus off, and Antiochus named him high priest. So for the first time now, you have an outside emperor naming the high priest of Israel. All right, so Israel has entered law. So this was a Hellenized Jew, right? And he is now the high priest. And so you can see the foothold that's being gained in Jerusalem here and what's going on. So then a guy named Menelaus comes along and he decides, I want the high priesthood. And so he outbids Jason and Antiochus gives it to him. The whole thing about Antiochus the fourth is he just wants money, right? You can get anything out of this guy for money. Menelaus actually robbed the temple to be able to pay his bribe to Antiochus. And Menelaus then has Onias, who's still trapped in Antioch. He actually has him assassinated. So the true high priest of Israel, the lineage, is supposed to be the high priest, is assassinated at this point by Menelaus, the guy that paid to become the high priest. And then Jason eventually takes everything back from Menelaus. So there's this back and forth happening in Jerusalem. And in the meantime, actually hundreds of Jews in Jerusalem are being killed in the feud between Menelaus and Jason over the power, over the high priest power, right? So things are getting bad for the Jewish people, really, really, really bad. Antiochus IV, hearing about all this unrest that's going on in Jerusalem, decided to stop there on his way home from Egypt one day in 169 BC, plunders the temple while he's there, because that's what he does for money. And this began a series of increasingly stronger acts against the Jews in Jerusalem. In 167, this is the fateful year. 167. This is the year right here. Antiochus IV dispatches one of his commanders, Apollonius, with a large force. Apollonius approached Jerusalem feigning peaceful intentions, but instead he treated it as an enemy city. He butchered many of the people, a lot of people died that day. He took some people as slaves. The city was looted, partially destroyed. Its walls were pulled down, and he erected a citadel called the Acra in Jerusalem. And this became a Seleucid garrison, which stood for another 25 years as an ever present symbol of foreign domination. The citadel was more than just a garrison, though. It also was a colony of Hellenized pagans and renegade Jews. It functioned as a Greek city state with its own constitution surrounded by walls in the now undefended Jerusalem. The city became fully Hellenized at this point. The temple was now under the jurisdiction of the Akra, and Yahweh worship was to be incorporated into a form of Zeus worship. So the traditional Jewish beliefs were basically becoming outlawed at this point, being pushed out completely by force. Now, Antiochus IV realized that all Jewish rebellion was based in religion. So it hit him one day. He's like, these people are such a problem because of their religious beliefs. That's the source of the issue here. So he took steps to completely outlaw Jewish religious practice, and disobedience resulted in death. So these are the decrees that Antiochus makes at this point. All sacrifices were suspended. The Sabbath could no longer be recognized. Festivals could not take place. Copies of the law were destroyed. Circumcision of children was forbidden. Pagan altars were erected throughout the city. Unclean animals were sacrificed on them. Jews were forced to eat pig meat on pain of death. The pagan population in Jerusalem was urged to help force Jews to follow these new directives. Jews were forced to participate in the feast of Dionysus, and Jews were forced to offer the monthly sacrifice in honor of the king's birthday. And then in December of 167 BC, Antiochus transformed the temple's altar into an altar to Zeus, and a pig was sacrificed on the altar. So that was kind of the ultimate low point here. And it was at this point where the Jewish people really had some decisions to make. The people that were not Hellenized, were not embracing Greek culture, were trying to stay faithful to God, trying to stay faithful to the way they worshiped. Um, what are they supposed to do at this point? And many began holding on to the words of Jeremiah still, hundreds of years later. Remember, I said that was important back then. When Jeremiah, in the Babylonian exile, he said, do nothing and trust God. Trust God, like he's got this. There were a few that held to that. Whoever the author of the book of Daniel seems to have held to that and was teaching that through his writings. There was also a very large group of people that joined something called the Maccabean Revolt. You guys heard of this before? The Maccabean Revolt. So a guy named Mattathias raises up him, and he's got four sons, and they lead a revolt against the Seleucids and actually fight for a few decades to come. And in the end, they actually do win their independence. And the Jews, once again, in 141 BC, so from 167 to 141, all this fighting is going on. And eventually, in 141, they do regain their independence and they actually become an autonomous state for the first time since before the Babylonian exile, and remained that way up to 63 BC when the Romans came in and destroyed them. Now, there was a lot of political stuff going on during that whole time period. One of the reasons the Maccabean revolt actually worked is because they became allies with Rome, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So they became allies with Rome, and but eventually, you get your own power back, you get your own dominance, and they're like, okay, so we can start not, being nice to Rome, and that's when General Pompey of Rome in 63 says, okay, swish like love, and then enters the New Testament, right? The Jerusalem's controlled by the Romans. So that's kind of what's happening at this point. So in 167 BC, Jerusalem's half destroyed. There's a forced Greek presence. It's illegal to worship God as the Old Testament prescribes that you should. The temple, the altar in the temple has been completely desecrated. It's an altar just a pig has been offered there. And this is where the Jewish people. And so it was during the tumultuous period under Antiochus IV that the eschatological hopes, end time hopes for the Jewish people hit a high point, right? Many people began to look for the day of the Lord to come and put an end to this level of control for them. Because at this point, they're sitting there and they've got to be thinking back. I mean, you guys are probably familiar with some lines in the Old Testament where God is making promises again that, I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you. We quote that all the time, right? Jeremiah 29:11. But you have to remember that the original context of that line was Jeremiah was saying that to the people going into Babylonian exile. He says, you may be going into exile, and my word to you is to do nothing and let God do his thing. But I promise you that God has plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Right? Jeremiah also said things like, in 70 years, the exile will be over. I mean, that never was, that was like partially kind of came to be because some of them came back home. It wasn't quite 70 years, it was 70 years-ish. We do get into trouble if we try to take numbers literally in prophecy. We talk a lot about numbers in this class, the problems of trying to take them literally. 70 is kind of a whole number, it's 7, right? But from the perspective of the people living here, they may be looking at that 70-year prophecy and saying, did that ever happen? Like, sure, we're back in Jerusalem, but we might as well be in exile. The way we're being destroyed, we can't even worship God. So the idea that, okay, God had promised there's a day of the Lord coming. There's this day where he's going to come and change everything, right? Where he's going to punish the wicked and he's going to offer salvation to the faithful. Like, is that going to happen? Is that day coming? So that in that time period, those questions are being asked like never before. And I'm sure our lives have probably, none of us in this room have probably never been that bad. But I know we've definitely had days where we're like, God, can you just show up already? I'm not the only one, right? Like, you know what that is, that little fleeting feeling of like, okay, God, time to just end this thing, man. We're done, right? So, but imagine what they're going through, the promises they're holding on to. And this is really that situation right there, not the specific one, but just what they've been dealing with for these centuries, was really where apocalyptic literature was born out of. It was to address this need, to address this situation of the promise of God that He would make things right. Can I still believe that? Right? Can I still believe that? Because everything that's going on around me just feels like pure chaos. Everything that's happening feels like it's completely out of control. And I believe that I serve this God Yahweh who has the control over everything. And I read the stories about what he did and the plagues of Egypt and all this kind of stuff. But then I see a man like Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes to just be allowed to do what he's doing. What am I supposed to believe? Do you feel that? This is where they were. And I think it's maybe not to that extreme, and sometimes to that extreme, depending on your experience. But Christians over the centuries to this day have had moments where they feel that, where they ask that question. And, we still have places around the world today where you can be killed for serving God, right? Thankfully, we don't live in a place like that. But many, many, many thousands, millions of Christians do. And this is why the word of this book is so important to that situation. Because it's a situation that Christians will always be in, followers of God will always be in. But they were in a place where they needed a word. They were in a place where they needed reassurance from God that He's still there, He's still in control, and He's still going to take care of this thing. And again, a lot of the apocalyptic literature that began to happen came out of this. All right, so that's it. That's the end of the history part. Did you guys bear with me on that? Is it too painful? I know you come to a class on Daniel, you don't expect a history lesson. I'm sorry. It'll pay off. And starting next week, we are going to get into the book, I promise. But we have to lay all that groundwork. But before we get there, I just want to share a little bit more about apocalyptic literature before we end here tonight. So, like I said, apocalyptic literature is a genre of writing. It's a type of writing that began to develop years after the Babylonian exile. And like I said, we don't have anything like it today. When you read the books of Daniel and Revelation, there's just not stuff written. But what you may not know, and what many modern Christians don't know, is that books like Daniel and Revelation are all over the place in ancient Jewish literature. I have just a short list here that I've written down. So there's books like First Enoch, the Sibylline Oracles, the Apocryphon of Ezekiel, Fourth Ezra, Apocalypse of Abraham. That's one of my personal favorites. Read the Apocalypse of Abraham. It's a fun read. Apocalypse of Elijah. Right there is throughout this intertestamental period and even into the first century or two after Christ, there's this 300 to 400 year time period where we see a ton of books written in this genre. And what is this genre? What are the characteristics of this genre? First of all, it's called apocalyptic because usually some kind of truth is being revealed. Remember, I started with that tonight. That the word apocalypse means revelation, something that's being revealed, right? That's all that it means. It just means something's being revealed. So typically, the chosen medium for these books is to write visions, dreams, how vivid, mysterious symbols and images, and all of them mean something that speaks to your current situation. So here's where we get to a really interesting, sometimes contentious point. The question of the dreams and visions that we read about in the book of Daniel, the dreams that he claims to have, these visions. Is this an actual person actually having these dreams? And then an actual angel showing up and interpreting them? Like, are we to take this literally? Or is this a literary device that's used to bring truth? Right? And I would say the latter is probably what's true here. Because what we see over and over and over again in these books, this just became literature. As much as metaphor is part of poetry, fantastic and mysterious, crazy images and dreams and all this kind of stuff is part of apocalyptic literature. And it was basically the vehicle that was used to get the message across. So I know that sounds kind of crazy, but that seems to be what's going on here. And if all you have to go off is Daniel and Revelation, you might not be aware of that. But when you realize that the amount of Jewish literature that we have that's apocalyptic is probably, I don't know for sure, if I had to take a guess, it's probably about 10 times the size of what our Bible is. Like that's how much we have. And it's crazy to me that most modern Christians don't even know it exists. We have so much literature from the intertestamental period from the Jewish community. It's crazy how much we have. And it's very fascinating to read. And when you're reading it, you're like, this sounds like the book of Daniel. This sounds like the book of Revelation. So, yeah. That's the question. Why is Daniel canonical, not pop? Why is he pop? Right. Right. That's a fantastic question. And I mean, we at this point like don't know the exact process that was, that was gone through that people decided, yeah, Daniel needs to be part of the canon or whatever. But apocalyptic literature is not the only kind of Jewish literature that's not in the canon. I mean, just like in Christian, the New Testament, we have all these writings from church fathers, some going back almost, to like the late first century. Like some of them we have is like written the same time Revelation might have been written, like depending on when you date it or whatever. But some books of the New Testament are dated towards the end of the first century, and we actually have church fathers writing at that time. Why aren't they in the canon, right? So my basic not cop out, but not cop out answer is, I believe this to be the inspired word of God, and I believe God had his hand in it, and that's why. Right? Like, because, yeah, this is the inspired word of God, and he saw fit to make sure it was included. So the nuts and bolts of how it actually went down, I don't, but yeah. Not a list of, it's not an authoritative list of books. Mm-hmm. It's a list of authoritative books. And Daniel is an authoritative book. Yep. And that's good. Yep, absolutely. Something that's really telling about the book of Daniel and how we're to understand it and approach it, because in our modern Christian Bibles, um, the book of Daniel is lumped right in there with all the books of prophecy, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, right? Limitations in there, but and then he's in the middle of all the prophetic books, and we usually just think of it as a book of prophecy and kind of lump it in there with all the other prophetic books. In the Hebrew canon, if you look up a Hebrew Bible, one of the first things you'll notice if you look through the table of contents, the books are in a different order than our Christian Bibles. And the book of Daniel is not part of the prophetic books. They do not consider Daniel to be a book of prophecy. It's part of what's called the Ketuvim, or the writings. And so it's in the same grouping as Esther, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah. These are all the writings. So even when the Hebrew canon was put together and ordered, Daniel was not understood to be on within the prophetic literature. So it's something different. It's something all unique, all on its own, right? And just a cursory reading of it, you could be like, yeah, it is different. The Book of Maccabees. Yeah, right there too, or right. Well, see, these are all these are good questions, but they're definitely different questions. So you have, I'll real quick say this because we're talking about Jewish writings and writings that are not included in our Protestant Bibles. So basically, when we're talking about religious texts, we have a few different categories. We have what we consider the word is canon, meaning it's been measured and put into our Bible. So part of our scriptural canon. So we have canonical books. Okay, those are the books that are in our Bible. And then we have apocryphal and deuterocanonical books, which these are books that are found in some Christian Bible somewhere. So if you open up a Catholic Bible, you will find there are books included in that are not included in the Protestant Bible. If you open up an Eastern Orthodox Bible, you'll see different books still. If you go to the Ethiopian church, you're going to find Enoch in there, right? So there are actually different canons of scripture in different Christian beliefs. So these books are either referred to as canonical, apocryphal, deuterocanonical, and then we have a group of writings that are not in anybody's canon, but are a part of the religious literature of the time and are very, very important. And these are called the pseudepigrapha. The reason why they're given that name is because most of them are written pseudepigraphally, meaning whoever wrote them as if they were somebody else writing them. For example, like the Apocalypse of Abraham. was probably written in about the first, maybe second century AD, but whoever wrote it as if it was actually Abraham writing it. And that was how these books were typically written. So I actually have at home on my bookshelf, I have a 2 volume set of the Snoop writings, and each volume is about that thick. So it's massive. It's like 2,000 pages worth of writings that I've read that much into. But I do when I can, right? So yeah, I can't get too much into it, but there's a lot out there, and there are some that are in different Bible canons than others, and all that kind of stuff. And even if you look at the Catholic Bible, you're going to find a few chapters in the book of Daniel that are not in the Protestant. But I know, crazy questions that we don't have time to fully get into tonight. Um, but just let me get back to this because I do need to wrap it up here shortly. Specifically, trying to understand the apocalyptic genre. So it's written under a pseudonym. Why was this done? You think in modern times, you think, okay, if I were to start writing and I pretended to be William Shakespeare and I said, hey, look, here's a new book by William Shakespeare. First of all, I can fool nobody if I were. But secondly, we'd be like, that's horrible, right? That's deceptive. Just the modern standards of writing. You don't try to pass your work off as somebody else's. You just don't do that. Is a horrible thing. So I think a lot of times when we hear about all these writings being done, like someone wrote pretending to be Daniel from centuries prior, our first modern reaction to that is a little bit of horror. You're like, well, that's deception, that's lying, and how can that be in the Bible, right? But first of all, we can't put our modern ethical standards of how you write a book upon an ancient. It was actually probably done for a pretty good reason. See, in the second century BC, it was believed that at that point there really was no more prophecy to be added to the canon, right? God was not speaking through prophets the way that He was back then, and any person that would consider themselves a prophet would be considering themselves would be a very presumptuous thing, and no one was presumptuous enough to call themselves a prophet. So they believed they had a word from God. They believed they had a message to share. But how do I get people to read it? How can I ensure that these people actually read my message? Well, if I say, hey, look, I found something Daniel wrote. You should read this. Because Daniel was a known figure, right? And there have been traditions of Daniel going back. We have other accounts of a Daniel figure, a very wise figure from Israel's past. So it wasn't for stealing glory or fame. It wasn't, I can become known if this happens, or it wasn't anything like that. It was simply, this is how the message gets out, number one. Number two, these, like I said, well, if you look here, there's two main kinds of apocalyptic literature. And thankfully in our Bible, we have an example of each. There's historical review and heavenly journey. So apocalypses were written in one of two ways. The first way was historical review. You write as if you're writing from someone hundreds of years ago. Enoch's another example, the book of Enoch. Remember Enoch, he's the guy that lived way back in the early chapters of Genesis, right? So in Enoch's book, he writes about Adam and Eve being born. He's actually wrote something, the book of Enoch contains something called the animal apocalypse. And it's basically the history of the Jewish people or of humanity from the time of Adam and Eve, going all the way up to the Greek period, because all this was written about this time period, and it was written like as if all these people were animals. So that's why it's called the Animal Apocalypse. So when you read it, you're like, oh, Enoch, way back in early creation, is predictively prophesying all these things to happen. When in reality, it was something in the future, just writing it as if it was. And that's what we have in the book of Daniel, right? We have the future events Daniel being written as if Daniel's writing it, looking forward. So if you're reading a book and you're in that situation that I just described about the Jewish people. The world's falling apart. It feels like chaos. It feels like it's out of control. And then you're getting the message that, oh, this was prophesied hundreds of years ago. Then all of a sudden you get the message that this isn't a surprise to God. Everything that's happening doesn't surprise him. Everything that's happening is ordained of God. It was prophesied by God. Like, it's not out of control because He's aware, that this was going to happen. and made it aware years ago. Now, again, in reality, did Daniel write this all down hundreds of years prior? Seems like not. But the message is still the same. What the reader gets from it is this security that none of this is a surprise to God. And that's the core message. That I can take that with me with faith, knowing that God is in control. And that's a good message. And the way that message gets across may vary, you know, but if you can get that message, the message is still true. The message is the truth, right? It's just how do we get that message across? And apocalyptic literature would take some pretty crazy ways to get that message across. So historical review, that was one of the big ways apocalyptic literature would happen. Another big way was the heavenly journey. So a figure would be whisked into some kind of heavenly realm and be shown all these incredible things. That's what we see in Revelation, right? We see John being whisked into heaven, and he sees all of these things, right? So those are the two main ways: historical review or heavenly journey, and we're going to learn a lot about both of them in this class. So okay, so that brings me up to 8:21. So I got to start wrapping up here. There's a few things in this handout, like I said, I didn't spend a ton of time on. Take some time this week, look back over it. I'm sure many of you, maybe your brain's spinning at this point. I hope I didn't scare you too badly. Um, I want you, like I said, bottom line is if we can have a little bit of an understanding of what was going on in the history from kind of like the 6th to the 2nd century with the Jewish people. As we then get into the visions of Daniel, it's going to make sense. It's all going to start to click, and I think you're going to have some light bulbs come on. You're going to be like, "Oh, that one always used to sound so crazy. That sort of makes sense now." So that's my encouragement to you. Like I said, try to remember to bring this handout back with you. Keep this one with you so you can have that timeline and the maps. The map of the divided kingdoms. That's gonna become really important in future weeks and all that kind of stuff. So, like I said, I'll be hanging around if you want to have any questions or conversation afterwards. I'm here. But let me go ahead and pray. Lord, I thank you so much for this incredible book, and I just pray that as we spend some time over the coming weeks in this, that you'll just teach it to our hearts, that your message will become clear, what it is that you spoke to your people thousands of years ago, and what you're still speaking to us today. We thank you for your incredible word, and I just can't wait to see what you're going to do with it throughout the remainder of these lessons. We thank you for this and pray this all in your name. Amen. Amen. All right, love you guys. Have a wonderful night. Hope to see you next time.